And I'm going to hand it over to Tim, as he's now going to talk about, very relevant here is helping address some of the very issues you've raised, the use of secondary BCA tests.
Thanks. And as an introductory point, I'll just note that a lot of situations, the BCAs can be fairly straightforward. And once you've got your primary test and you've got your inputs, you plug the numbers in, you get your results, and you're done. But in some cases, it's just not that simple. And it does require additional thinking. And the whole theme of what we're about to talk about now is that you don't have to stop at that point, that you can take the data that you have and the concepts that you developed in your benefit cost analysis framework and keep going and keep analyzing and looking at the data in different ways to help resolve some of these challenging questions. So first, secondary tests. There's a couple of uses where secondary tests are extremely helpful. One is, and Julie mentioned this earlier, if you've got inconsistent policy goals for different types of DERs, how do you come up with a single test to address all those? I'll talk about that. And then what about, the implications of achieving policy goals? Like how much should customers pay for that? And what are the rate impacts of that? That's a question that comes up a lot. How to address DERs that are kind of marginally cost effective or heavily debated between stakeholders. So we're going to go into a couple of examples to try to demonstrate how to use secondary tests to address some of these questions. Next slide. So in this case, we have a set of policy goals where for some DERs, it requires certain impacts to be included, but for others it doesn't. And you already had a poll about this where we asked you about the narrow interpretation or the broad interpretation. And now we're applying that. And what you see here on your screen is a graph of several totally hypothetical DERs, just to make the point. And we have the benefit cost ratios. Anything above 1 is cost effective. In this case, the primary test is broadly defined. It includes some policy goals that are required for some DERs, but aren't required for others. Nonetheless, it's chosen as the primary test. And you can see that the benefit cost ratios are sorted according to that test. And in this case, just by that test, hey, everything is cost effective. But someone might ask, well, wait a second, this test is pretty broad. And for some of the DERs, these policy goals weren't required. What if we were really to look at this using a narrow test? And again, this is like a reality check that one can do. It's not necessarily determinative. The primary test is just what it says. It's the primary test. But maybe there's some situations where you want to deviate from that. And that's what the secondary test helps you with. So in this case, the secondary test is narrow. And as you can see, the green bars are all shorter, less benefits than the primary test. And in some cases, from DERs 3, 4, 5, and 6, they pass both tests, so there's really no issue. But then for 2 and 1, suddenly you've got the primary test passes, but secondary test it doesn't. And then this is where the art comes in. I think I would call it not so much art as professional judgment and ultimately the regulatory judgment. What do you do with these? And so we're going to ask your next poll question is like, which of these 6 DERs would you consider cost effective based upon what you've just seen? And if you need to, you can slide that poll box over to the right to reveal the bar chart.
I don't take the poll, so I get to comment that DER1, that would be a tough call. I'm interested in seeing what people have to say. All right, I'm going to end the poll.
Interesting. So in my view, if I may, I see 3, 4, 5, and 6 is kind of obvious. Yeah, it passes both tests. So why wouldn't you? Does anybody want to respond maybe in the chat? Or I think you can do it verbally as to why 3, 4, 5, or 6 wouldn't be considered cost effective.
And we have a question from Elaine Hill at NREL. Maybe the question could be modified. Each DER is being evaluated on multiple objectives, perhaps some more important than others. And maybe there was confusion because the numbering was inversed in the chart. If people were surprised by their results and they were confused, can you just chat that in? We can always relaunch the poll if there's a misinterpretation, so let us know. Okay, so somebody else agrees that the inverse order could have affected the results also. Should we give this another shot? All right, let's give it another shot.
Apologies for that confusion there. Yes, the one is at the bottom in the graph and at the top on the poll. And
while that's going, yeah,
can you question about multiple objectives? What we were trying to get across is that that's the difference between the two tests. The narrow test is only considering, well, the narrowest set of goals. And the broader one is considering more. We could go back up to the slide Julie presented with this. I think the difference was low-income benefits and was it greenhouse gases or job benefits in the broad one.
But the good point is being made that unless I can break down that information, you know, what does that, I don't have all the information. And I think objectives is something that we'll get into in the next deep dive section as well.
Yeah. Okay. And so rather than taking too long on this, I think the reordering helped, an explanation helped. Yeah, 1 and 2 clearly are the marginal ones, the questionable ones. And I think you could make a call either way on this. You know, you might say that, well, for DER1, the secondary test is so close that, you know, fine, we'll go with it. And there may be some stakeholders in the room that feel like that's a really important DER. DER2 is like, well, I don't know, it's not that close. So this might be the one we're going to cut. And again, this is where it's professional judgment and maybe agency priority as much as anything else.
And Tim, the other result I observe is that 6 and 3 are considered cost effective by 89% of those polled because 6 and 3, the primary and secondary tests are closer in their result relative to 4 and 5.
That's one way to look at it. Again, I would say if it passes both tests, what's the problem? But I could see that that's a fine interpretation one might make.
Yep.
And here's the reason, the thing about this and why we're going through this is that this is the kind of discussion that happens when you get in stakeholder meetings and you're trying to resolve some of these issues. And the whole purpose of the NSPM is to create the framework, the definitions, the principles, and all the constructs so that when you have that conversation, you've got consistent language and you've got everybody knows what they're talking about and the framework is all laid out. And then you're just left with the judgment calls and the agency priority calls.
Yep. And breaking out those blue lines, the impacts that are beyond the utility system impacts, what are those different chunks, if you will? And then what are the priority objectives if there is a need? If you've eliminated 1 and 2 and there's still a need to eliminate based on a budget constraint or some other constraint, that's where those considerations need to be made.
Yes, so we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Is what if you had a set of DERs that are all cost effective, but you can't afford them all? And again, we'll get to that soon. That's a big one. So let's go to the next slide. This is really the same point. In this case, though, we flipped it, where for whatever reason, the stakeholders and ultimately the commission have decided, we want to use the narrowly defined test because we're just not comfortable with some of those additional impacts. You know, that some of those goals didn't really apply to some of the DER. So they start with the narrower one. And you can see here, the primary test, the narrowest one, that's in blue, and we've sorted them. Notice that how they're sorted so that the least cost effective is at the bottom. And in this case, under the primary test, some of them are not cost effective because it's narrower. There's fewer benefits included. And so the question is, okay, for DERs 1 and 2, they don't pass the primary test, but if you look at the secondary test, where we included a couple of other benefits, and let's keep it simple. Let's say in this case, it's just the low income benefits. Should you consider, one of those as cost effective, even though the primary test is benefit cost ratio is below 1? So let's try another poll on that and recognize the ordering is again reversed between the poll and the chart. And so as you're thinking, for DER number 5, there's no low income impacts at all. So they're the same. Whereas for DER 6, the low income impacts are pretty big. And therefore you see that huge deviation between the results. And we're simplifying this to make a point. But if one wants to find out about low income impacts and how it affects things, you could tailor your test or at least your analysis to this question we have before us in this presentation. That's closer to what I would expect. DER 2, it looks like a few people decided that was worth it. DER 1, not very many, but 3 through 6 are more obviously cost effective. Again, I'm kind of curious. I don't know if we have time, but I would ask whoever thought 5 or 6 or 3 was not cost effective as to why not. The primary test that this group decided on was they passed, and they passed the secondary tests, but there may be reasons I haven't articulated.
Well, let's invite discussion. I think that this is, there's no right answer here, and it would be good to get the a sense of people's responses. And again, no right answer. So more just helpful to have context of how this information informed your decision.
So there's a question there from Michael. Would DER number 2 even make it to the secondary test during your whole process if it didn't pass the primary test? That's a great question as to when do you apply secondary tests, and how often do you iterate and go through all these tests? And what we're talking about now is just the unique situation, which actually might be fairly common, but it's the situation where a jurisdiction couldn't come up with a single test as the primary test, and yet it wants to evaluate different DER types. And so it's stuck with a dilemma. What test do we use? And if you want to at least come as close as possible to using a consistent test, you choose these 2. And if you're in that situation, then I would recommend that when the utility prepares its analysis, or whoever does it, they present both primary and secondary, like right up front, because you need that in order to make some of these calls. There may be other situations we'll talk about in a minute. For example, marginal resources, where you don't have to have the secondary tests because it's not relevant except for very rare situations. Okay. Other questions, thoughts, comments? Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, there might be situations where some DERs are what you might call marginally cost effective. Either, as we have in this example now, under the primary test, they're just below 1. In this case, I've got 3. They're all just below 1. But you could do the same thing where they're just above 1. You might have the benefit cost ratio is 1.1. And some stakeholders, the commission, might feel like that's just too close for my comfort, given all the uncertainties here. I think that's marginal. So in this case, you can do a secondary test. And here, which you choose for a secondary test might depend. And I know of one state that went through this whole process for their energy efficiency goals. And you probably won't be surprised, but when they got to the goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and whether those environmental externalities should be included in their test, about half the room said no, and half the room said yes. So what they decided was, okay, in the primary test, we're not going to include greenhouse gases, but in the secondary test, we are. And that way we can have an informed discussion about how that affects the results. So let's assume that that's the case here. And in this case, we've got under the primary test, it's, whatever is included, it does not include greenhouse gases. But in the secondary test, the one thing they add is greenhouse gases. And what they find is this, that without greenhouse gases, they're all below 1. With it, the DER 3 is still below 1, 2 is well above, and number 1 is just above. So with that background, I'm going to ask another poll. Same question, which of these would you consider cost effective? And while you're doing that, I noticed a comment about greenhouse gas emission quantification is subjective. And there's no question, in fact, I mentioned earlier that there's several ways to come up with the externality values of greenhouse gases. I would push back and say that while there is big uncertainty in all the values, there are ways to do it. You have to recognize that in any BCA, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of things that change, even something as simple as fuel price forecasts and even load growth. So just because something is uncertain doesn't mean that you can't quantify and monetize it. The goal is to do your best with the information you've got. So that may not be a comfortable answer, but it seems to be increasingly adopted in states that are trying to wrestle with the greenhouse gas issues. Okay, so looks like most people thought DER2, should be considered cost effective, maybe because the benefits were enough to cross that barrier, whereas not so much for 1 and certainly even less for 2. I'm sorry, even less for 3. And that's, each one of those positions is reasonable. And again, the whole purpose of this is to enable a discussion whereby you can really lay out what those differences are, rather than sitting in a room and butting heads once again about greenhouse gases or not. At least you've got a formula and a framework for kind of laying out your costs and benefits and thinking through how to address them. Okay, so this is the third application of secondary tests, and I think this is one of the more interesting ones. So here we have a hypothetical jurisdiction, and they have, this is the question of, what's it going to cost us to achieve these policy goals? How much is it worth to, in one case, electric customers or gas customers to achieve these goals? So we have a hypothetical where there is a primary test that includes the utility system impacts and greenhouse gas impacts. And I'm including just one above the utility system impacts to be clean, simple, and to make a couple of points here. But, this could be done with any other impacts. It could be done with jobs or low income, and it could be multiple. But if you really want to identify the impacts of achieving specific policy goals at each one, then it helps to kind of isolate them. So that's what this exercise is about. And then in this case, every single one of these DERs passes the test. Everyone is considered cost effective. And so, however, in this particular jurisdiction, the commission has expressed concern that the utility is spending too much consumer funding to pay for greenhouse gas benefits. And it wants to know, how much are we paying for this? And is it worth it? And so that's kind of the question that's put before this particular hypothetical state. And I think it's a question that comes up, at least in different ways in different states. And if I'm not mistaken, do we have another poll for this one, Julie? Sorry, I've forgotten. The next slide.
On the next slide, we're going to ask people what type of, yeah, let me go to it.
Next slide, please. So we're going to point out that one of these tests here, maybe even more than one, you could choose more than one, will help understand the impacts, especially the impacts on customers of achieving the policy goals. Which one or ones of these do you think is going to be most helpful? And is it true, Kerry, that people can choose more than one?
No, on this one, I said select one.
Oh, you did. That was your choice. Okay, which is good. Because, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting results. So this is going to take a little explanation. I'll start with the one that got the most votes, the rate impact measure test. That is a natural sort of test that people go to think, how is this going to affect ratepayers? How is it going to affect rates? And to some extent, it can help in that way. But as we'll talk about in the last deep dive we've got today, rate impacts require a thorough understanding of rate impacts requires more than the RIM test. And the RIM test actually can kind of confuse things and conflate cost effectiveness with rate impacts. And so I'll talk a lot more about that next, very soon, in fact. And so I would not recommend the rate impact measure test. In fact, we authors of the manual feel like there's very little role for that test. Instead, it's almost always better to use a full-blown rate impact analysis, which I'll talk about. The participant impact test is interesting. It tells you what's going to happen to those host customers who install the DERs. In this case, it doesn't really answer the question about policy goals, though, so I'm not sure that's particularly helpful. Societal cost test, I think that would be an obvious one. I'm not surprised that several people chose that because, it tells you like the whole societal cost. However, the question here is, what are the impact of achieving these policy goals? And as we explained a minute ago, there's really just one that we're looking at, and that's greenhouse gases. So if you compare that result to the societal cost test, all you're doing is adding more policy goals. It doesn't necessarily help so much. The same is true with the total resource cost test. That includes host customers, which sort of muddies the water some and doesn't really help give you a clean comparison of impacts on ratepayers of policy goals. So that leaves the utility cost test, which is, in my sense, one of the most useful tests of all. And it's surprising that it doesn't get used more often. The utility cost test will tell you how the DER that you invest in or you're investigating will affect revenue requirements, costs to those customers that are putting up the money. And so it's the one thing that will tell you, how this is going to affect bills and rates. And so the answer to this question, in my view, is the utility cost test gives you the best way to assess these policy goals. And in the next slide, we'll show you why that's true. Can you go to the next slide? So you're probably getting familiar with these bar charts now. Here we have the jurisdiction-specific test, the primary test, that includes utility costs and benefits and greenhouse gases. And that's it. There's nothing else in there. So the difference between the green bar and the blue bar is the benefit including greenhouse gas impacts. And by that, I mean the externalities, not the cost of compliance with existing greenhouse gas requirements, because that's a part of the utility cost test. These are just the externalities. And what we've done here is we've sorted them by the utility cost test. You'll notice the numbers are different because by that test, they're ranked differently. And what this means is that for any DER where the utility cost test is less than 1, it means that the cost to utility customers are going to go up. If the benefit cost ratio for the utility cost test is above 1, it means costs go down. If costs go down, average bills go down. If costs go up, average bills go up. So what this tells you is the difference between the blue line and the green line is the additional benefits of adding greenhouse gas externalities to your test. And so you might decide, well, geez, for DERs 2, 4, and 6 at the top here, it passes both. Even with the greenhouse gas benefits, we can be content that we're going to have a net reduction in utility costs anyway. So it's like a no-brainer. Once you start getting the situation where the utility cost test is below 1, then you realize, okay, this is going to actually increase average bills in order to achieve these greenhouse gas benefits. So is it worth it, is the question. And just as one example, I guess this example came up with the discussion on Monday with Julie and Commissioner Anthony, where, what if you have electric vehicle charging stations that the utility has to pay for? And it just turns out that they don't pay for themselves just looking at the utility costs and benefits alone. But boy, they have huge greenhouse gas benefits. And that might be, this DER number 3 here. And the question then before the stakeholders and then ultimately the commission is it worth paying, a little bit more, having those net costs as opposed to net benefits for just the utility system impacts to achieve those greenhouse gas benefits? And that's a judgment call, a policy call that each stakeholder in each jurisdiction has to make. And in case you're worried about that, I'm going to talk about that in a minute too. But the key message I hope is made clear here is that if you're juggling, policy goals, and that's the one aspect that people get a little nervous about is how much to pay for it. It's a fairly easy analysis you can make, and all this information is readily available. You put this chart together, and then at least it gives you information to make that judgment call, policy call about which of these you want to spend money on.
Okay, so we covered some ground there in terms of these different applications of secondary tests. We are going to change the slide. Here we go. So again, oops, I'm sorry. So again, please share with us what you just learned in terms of use of secondary tests. We were going to do this at the end of the day to get all your takeaways, but we figure for each deep dive, this is fresher in your minds here to just share now what you just learned and what Tim shared and the polls you took. What's a key takeaway or question that you may have and share with the group? And then we'll take a short break. And feel free to chat or even to unmute yourself and speak up. Tim, while people are writing, I have a clarifying question. You confused me a little bit because you mentioned here when you were referring to the utility cost test, you said this shows how it will affect bills and rates.
Yes.
I thought that we were going to, that rate affecting rates and rate impacts is more part of a rate impact analysis. So that confused me a bit.
It is. But as we'll describe in the next section of our discussion, the utility costs and benefits are the foundation of the rate impact analysis as well as the BCA. So it does affect both. Maybe it's cleaner at this point to think about it as average bills. But it does inform rate impacts. It just doesn't tell you much about them in and of itself. Sorry if that wasn't particularly clear.
Okay, so some of the comments, Joe says the utility cost test provides useful information, basic to much of the overall analysis. Clearly, policy goals are critical for evaluation. Great, simplest, most straightforward explanation by Tim in the scope of the different cost tests. Yep. Chris says secondary tests can help provide additional focus on evaluating different options. Yes, there are a number of people who apply cost effectiveness very, very strictly. Yep.
Actually, that's the one theme we're trying to get across here is you don't have to do this strictly. You need to be thoughtful about the data. And there's all kinds of ways to be thoughtful and use it to answer your questions that you have.
Okay, this is some great feedback. Okay, good. This is some very helpful feedback. There's a comment up above. Danielle, let me go back up there. I'm trying to think of what comment that is. Sometimes it's a little, oh, considering greenhouse gases increases the cost. And at what cost level a regulator can justify the increased costs?
Yeah, I guess I'd paraphrase the question is like, why should customers pay an increased cost to reduce greenhouse gases? That's another way to put it. And how can regulators justify that? And in those cases where they might require increased cost, it would be because the state has greenhouse gas goals, targets, caps, and they've got to find some way to meet them. And DERs are one way. They might be the lowest cost way. And even though the net cost seems to be positive, it might be less cost than doing it through other means. I hope that helps. There's actually a very gray area. When greenhouse gas targets are vague and not clearly defined and not like assigned to, say, the utility sector, then they're kind of like externalities. You can't really put them into your utility system costs. But then, which happens a lot, states then move and creates a very concrete cap and a very concrete timeline. You have to reduce emissions by X% by 5 years. Then suddenly you've got a directive that means you've got to increase your utility system costs. And then that becomes a part of the utility costs. It's no longer an externality. It becomes internalized. So that's one of the hard things about greenhouse gas emissions is they start out as externalities and you kind of wonder, why pay for that? But in some cases, they move towards internal costs based upon policy goals and sometimes statutes. And then it becomes an easier call.
And I would just add a very important point you made about, states increasingly have carbon emission reduction goals. And I actually don't know to what extent they, or statutes with specific goals, and to what extent different sectors are identified as trying to achieve a portion of that goal or a percentage of that goal. And I think it does become complicated. And I would be interested, I think it's very important to hear, from the different states about where are their efforts for goals that cut across industries and sectors, where you have this now, transportation sector, and then the electric industry and the different, Department of Transportation and PUCs that are both trying to work to achieve these goals or to identify the associated goals and value streams for DR investments, and then, you know, otherwise in the transportation industry, whether it's infrastructure, charging infrastructure, or otherwise. You know, how does that coordination happen, and is it happening? I'd be interested if anyone has any thoughts or comments on that, because that speaks to, you know, how much does the utility regulator and decisions around investments need to capture how much of that meeting that carbon goal vis-a-vis other sectors. I put that out there. If anyone has comments or thoughts, I'd appreciate them, but I know that we need to move on here. Okay.
Yeah, I have a comment.
Sure.
Yeah, this is Upendra Chivukula from New Jersey. We have very aggressive goals. You know, we have to reduce greenhouse 80% by 2050, and we have to go 100% clean energy by 2050, and 50% by 2030. And the challenge is that even if New Jersey reduces its greenhouse gases, you know, we have a lot of states to the west of us, right? There's no state east of us, so every state is west of us. And what about all those greenhouse gases that are going to be coming into New Jersey? So that is always a dilemma, you know, trying to see how. Also, in addition to that, the concept of leakage also creates a problem. You know, in state we signed up for RGGI, and in-state generation can reduce the greenhouse gases, but through the grid, the electrons that are coming, how do you know they're all green?
So that's an issue that goes beyond, you know, what we looked at in the manual, but I can give you a few thoughts, which is, in my experience, states and even nations who establish greenhouse gas targets for themselves are doing it as to be leaders and to, you know, because you're right that you can do all you want in New Jersey, but there's still the rest of the world. That's not just the rest of the states that are emitting greenhouse gases. And the notion is that if each state steps up and each country steps up and reduces, then we're going to have a solution to the problem. So you've raised a much bigger question that's really more suited to legislators than it is to benefit cost analysis. What we're talking about is, in your state, if you've got a goal, here's how you can crunch your numbers to help think about how you might achieve that goal.
Yes, and I think it also gets more complicated when you think of the public health impacts for some of these environmental, carbon or other criteria air pollutant goals. And I've seen and heard regulators speak. California, one example, a couple of years back at a NARUC meeting, where the chair indicated that, you know, or it was maybe a speaker from the PUC who pointed to a study where they had looked at the public health impacts associated with emissions from the sector. But then that further begs the question of, well, do electric ratepayers pay for that, or where do the public health, you know, where does the health industry come in all of this? And you know, we are seeing New York is one case where the governor issued a couple of years back this health across all policies order, where, you know, they are looking very specifically, because now they have that statute or the executive order that directs NYSERDA to look at occupant, actually this is in the case of occupant health impacts in buildings, and the role of weatherization programs to help address health impacts, and the coordination between their Department of Health and NYSERDA to implement this big pilot project they're they're trying to get off the ground, which of course has been interrupted by COVID. So let me just see, I think we do want to move on here. I think we were going to take a very short break.